The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on Emily Hart, the billionaire heiress who sat smugly in her designer suit, arms crossed, a smirk curling her lips. Across from her stood Daniel Cole, the victim of her reckless actions, trembling with anger and pain. Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. You're acting like I ruined your life." She turned to the judge, rolling her eyes. "I mean, really, Your Honor. He's exaggerating. People like him always do." A hushed gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Matthews, an older man with piercing blue eyes, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat, setting his gavel down with a controlled motion. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, because in a moment, I will say something that might change your life forever." Emily's smirk faltered. The room held its breath. 2 months earlier, the sun was shining bright over New York City, bouncing off the tall buildings as people rushed about their day. Among them was Daniel Cole, a hard-working single father, balancing 2 jobs to support his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Life wasn't easy, but he did everything he could to make her happy. Daniel worked as a mechanic during the day and as a rideshare driver at night. He barely got any sleep, but whenever he came home, Lily would greet him with a big hug, and that made it all worth it. That evening, after a long shift at the repair shop, Daniel picked up a ride request from a luxury hotel. When he pulled up, a tall, confident woman in a sleek black dress strutted toward his car. Emily Hart. She was a household name, an heiress to one of the biggest fashion empires in the world. Cameras followed her everywhere, and tonight was no different. Paparazzi snapped pictures as she slid into the back seat of his car. "Drive." "Quickly," she commanded, without so much as a glance at Daniel. He started the ride, navigating through the busy streets. Emily scrolled through her phone, not paying attention to anything else. Daniel stole a glance in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" Emily sighed dramatically. "I put the address in the app. Do I really need to repeat myself?" Daniel clenched his jaw and focused on the road. He had dealt with rude customers before, but something about her arrogance made his blood boil. Minutes later, the car came to a red light. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, another car swerved into their lane, speeding recklessly. Daniel's heart pounded as he slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The impact sent his car skidding into the intersection, flipping it onto its side. The world spun. Screams filled the air. Everything went black. When Daniel woke up, the sound of sirens rang in his ears. His head throbbed, his body ached, but all he could think about was Lily. He tried to move, but sharp pain shot through his leg. Paramedics rushed to his side, pulling him out of the wreck. Nearby, Emily Hart stood with her phone in hand, unharmed, but looking utterly annoyed. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, brushing off her dress as if the accident had merely been an inconvenience. Daniel groaned as he was placed on a stretcher. He looked toward Emily, expecting at least a sign of concern. Instead, she scoffed. "Great. Now I'm going to be late." She turned away, making a call. "Get me another car. I'm not dealing with this nonsense." Daniel's vision blurred from the pain, but he heard everything. His heart sank. He wasn't just some obstacle in her day. He was a person, a father, and she didn't care. That night, as Daniel lay in the hospital, doctors delivered the devastating news. His leg was severely fractured. He wouldn't be able to work for months. No driving, no repairs. His only source of income was gone. But the worst part? Emily Hart never even checked if he was okay. Weeks passed, and the bills piled up. Daniel's savings dried out. He struggled to put food on the table for Lily, all while Emily Hart continued her glamorous life, completely unaffected. Until the lawsuit. Daniel wasn't the type to fight back, but when his lawyer discovered that Emily had refused to testify, ignored police calls, and even tried to bribe hospital staff to keep quiet about the accident, he knew he had to take a stand. The case went to trial, and Emily, with all her money and power, assumed she'd walk away without consequence. She was wrong. Now, standing in front of Judge Matthews, she realized for the first time that this wasn't going to be easy. The way the judge looked at her, calm, calculating, sent a shiver down her spine. The room waited. And then Judge Matthews spoke. "Miss Hart, let me tell you something," he said, his voice steady. "In my years on this bench, I've seen many people like you, people who believe their wealth makes them untouchable. But today, you will learn that money does not buy decency. And it certainly does not buy justice." Emily swallowed hard. The courtroom was silent. Then, the judge leaned forward and delivered a sentence that made her face go pale. Judge Matthews' voice echoed through the courtroom. "Miss Hart, I am placing an immediate hold on your assets until this case is resolved. Furthermore, if you think you can walk away from this without consequences, think again. You will be held accountable for your actions in ways you never expected." Gasps filled the room. Emily's face drained of color. "What?" she blurted out, standing up. "You can't do that. I have businesses to run, properties, investments. You have no right." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "This is not about what you own. This is about what you lack: empathy, responsibility, and basic human decency." He turned his sharp gaze toward her. "Sit down, Miss Hart." Emily's legs trembled as she dropped back into her seat. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashed. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. 3 weeks earlier, Emily Hart had never known struggle. Born into wealth, she never had to worry about bills, food, or survival. Money had always solved her problems. If something went wrong, her lawyers, PR team, and influence made it disappear. She was used to people bowing to her, treating her like royalty, and she loved it. But ever since the accident, things had taken a strange turn. At first, she ignored it, just another minor inconvenience. Her PR team assured her it would blow over. They even offered Daniel money to keep quiet, a generous sum, enough to take care of him and his daughter for a year. But Daniel refused. "I don't want your money," he had told her lawyer over the phone. His voice was calm but firm. "I want justice." Emily had laughed when she heard that. Justice? What a joke. But then came the lawsuit. Then the media got involved. And now, sitting in this courtroom, with her accounts frozen and the judge's piercing gaze locked onto her, Emily felt something she had never felt before. Fear. The judge's words rang in her ears. "You will be held accountable in ways you never expected." What did that mean? She turned to her lawyer, whispering harshly, "Fix this. Now." Her lawyer, a man who had gotten celebrities out of worse scandals, wiped his forehead nervously. "Miss Hart, I think this might be bigger than we anticipated." Emily clenched her fists. No, she was Emily Hart. She didn't lose. Across the courtroom, Daniel sat quietly, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. His leg was still healing, and he had been forced to sell his car to cover medical expenses. His daughter, Lily, had been through weeks of stress, watching her father struggle. And Emily? She had continued going to fashion shows, vacationing on private islands, and throwing lavish parties. Daniel's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, with the evidence we have, we believe Miss Hart's actions weren't just reckless, they were intentional. She has shown no remorse, no attempt to make things right. This isn't just about negligence. This is about entitlement and cruelty." Emily scoffed. "Cruelty? Oh, please." She turned to Daniel. "This is ridiculous. You think you're some kind of victim? Accidents happen. Stop acting like I ruined your life." A stunned silence fell over the room. Daniel's lawyer took a deep breath. "Your Honor, this is exactly what we're talking about. No remorse. No accountability." Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair, studying Emily for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "Since Miss Hart refuses to understand the impact of her actions, I have made my decision." Emily straightened her back, preparing for a slap on the wrist, a fine, maybe some community service. But then, the judge spoke again. "I hereby order Miss Emily Hart to live under the same conditions as Mr. Cole for the next 90 days, without the privileges of her wealth. No bank accounts, no luxury cars, no assistance. She will be given only the amount of money that Mr. Cole has had since the accident. She will experience his life." The courtroom exploded in shock. Emily shot to her feet. "You can't do that. she shrieked. Judge Matthews slammed his gavel. You are about to learn, Miss Hart, that I can. Emily turned to her lawyer in a panic. Tell me this is a joke. Her lawyer hesitated. I've never seen a ruling like this before, but technically yes, he can. Emily felt her world spinning. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to win. Daniel, sitting in his chair, watched her reaction. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel satisfaction. He just felt tired. For weeks, he had struggled, not just with the physical pain, but with the emotional burden of knowing that someone who had hurt him didn't care at all. Now, at least, she would understand. Emily shook her head in disbelief. This is a nightmare. The judge looked straight at her. For you? Maybe. But for Mr. Cole? It's been reality. Emily Hart stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floors. Reporters swarmed her like vultures, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a chaotic mess of questions. Miss Hart, how do you feel about the judge's ruling? Are you worried about surviving without your wealth? Do you think this is justice for Daniel Cole? She clenched her jaw and pushed past them, her bodyguards struggling to hold them back. She needed to get out of here. She needed to fix this. Her car, a sleek black Rolls-Royce, was parked outside, waiting. She yanked open the door and slid in, slamming it shut behind her. Drive, she snapped at the chauffeur. The driver hesitated. Ma'am, he said, shifting uncomfortably. I've just received word. Your accounts have already been frozen. Your staff has been let go. Your vehicles, including this one, are no longer accessible to you. Emily's heart dropped. What? She whispered. The driver turned, avoiding her eyes. I'm sorry, Miss Hart. I have to go. He stepped out of the car, leaving her sitting there, stunned. The doors locked automatically. The engine turned off. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had nothing. She was stranded. Panic set in as she grabbed her phone, dialing her father. He always fixed things. He would fix this. But the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again. No answer. Her lawyer had warned her that her father was furious. The Hart family was all about reputation, and this scandal was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. If her father had decided to let her learn her lesson, she was truly alone. Emily's breathing quickened. She stepped out of the car, looking around the busy New York street. People walked past her, uninterested, as if she were invisible. She had never felt invisible before. She spotted an ATM nearby and rushed toward it, her designer purse clutched in her shaking hands. She swiped her card, pressed a few buttons. Account balance, $0. Her mouth went dry. She tried another card. And another. Declined. 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 A nervous laugh bubbled out of her lips. This was a joke. A sick, cruel joke. Wasn't it? Her stomach twisted as she realized what the judge had done. He hadn't just frozen her accounts. He had stripped her of everything. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, Rebecca. Emily, I'm so sorry. We've all been let go. Your penthouse is being locked down until the ruling is over. I can't help you anymore. Please take care of yourself. Emily read the message 3 times, but it didn't make sense. She had nowhere to go. No money. No staff. For the first time in her life, she wasn't Emily Hart, the billionaire heiress. She was just Emily. And Emily had no idea how to survive. Daniel Cole sat in his tiny apartment, rubbing his temples as he listened to the news coverage on his old TV. In a shocking courtroom decision, billionaire Emily Hart has been sentenced to live under the same financial conditions as her victim, Daniel Cole, for 90 days. Public reactions have been mixed, with some calling it poetic justice and others questioning the legal system's reach over personal wealth. Daniel sighed, muting the TV. He wasn't sure how to feel. Did Emily deserve to suffer? Maybe. But would this really change her? His daughter, Lily, ran into the room, her blonde curls bouncing as she climbed onto his lap. Daddy, are you still sad? She asked, tilting her head. He forced a smile. No, sweetheart. Just thinking. She frowned. Thinking about the mean lady? Daniel chuckled softly. Yeah. Lily hugged him tightly. Don't be sad. She's learning now, right? Maybe she'll be nice after. Daniel hesitated. Could people like Emily Hart really change? Emily sat on a park bench, hugging her arms. The temperature was dropping, and she had no idea where to go. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten all day. Normally, she'd have an assistant pick up an organic meal from some high-end restaurant. Now, she didn't even have enough for a cheap sandwich. The sun was setting. She glanced at the people around her. Some heading home from work, others laughing with friends. A few homeless individuals huddled under blankets near the benches. For the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't above them anymore. She was one of them. Her pride screamed at her to call someone, anyone, but she knew no one would help her. She had spent her whole life treating people like they were beneath her. Now, she was at the bottom. The thought made her chest tighten. Then, a new horror dawned on her. If she had nowhere to go, no food, and no money, where was she going to sleep tonight? Emily's heart pounded as the reality of her situation sank in. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the park. The air grew colder, and she instinctively hugged her arms around herself. She had nowhere to go. Her penthouse was locked down. Her money was gone. Her father wasn't answering. Her so-called friends? Probably already planning how to replace her in their social circles. For the first time in her life, she was nobody. Her designer heels ached against the pavement as she started walking, her breath coming out in shallow gasps. She didn't know where she was going. She just had to keep moving. She passed by busy restaurants where people sat laughing, clinking glasses. The smell of freshly baked bread and sizzling steaks made her stomach twist in hunger. But she couldn't walk inside. She had no credit card, no assistant to handle the bill. Her pride wouldn't let her beg. She kept walking. At first, she thought about going to a hotel, demanding they give her a room. But then she realized the judge had stripped her of her name's power. If she had no money, no one was obligated to help her. That thought alone made her want to scream. The streets grew quieter. Streetlights flickered on. Emily passed a small, run-down diner, and her stomach roared in protest. She stopped, pressing a hand to her abdomen, trying to ignore the discomfort. Then, she noticed something. Across the street, a man sat against the side of a building. His clothes were tattered, his beard unkempt. A cardboard sign sat in front of him. Hungry. Please help. Emily froze. She had never looked at people like him before. In her world, they were invisible. Background noise in her perfectly curated life. Now, she realized, she was no different. A deep, burning humiliation filled her chest. No, she refused to believe this was her reality. She turned quickly and walked in the opposite direction. She would figure something out. She always did. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his overdue bills. His legs still ached, but at least he was starting to heal. The trial had been exhausting. Now that it was over, he should have felt relief. But something about it still gnawed at him. Lily sat across from him, drawing on a piece of scrap paper with her crayons. She kicked her feet happily as she worked. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Daniel asked, trying to shake his thoughts. She grinned. "A castle." He chuckled. "A castle, huh? Are you the princess?" Lily wrinkled her nose. "No, I'm the knight. I protect people." Daniel felt his heart swell. "That's a big job." She nodded seriously. "Someone has to do it." He smiled, reaching over to ruffle her curls. A knock on the door interrupted them. Daniel frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He pushed himself up, using his crutches, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, he froze. Standing there, looking completely lost, was Emily Hart. Her hair was messy. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled. And for the first time ever, she looked small. Daniel's grip tightened on his crutch. "What are you doing here?" Emily hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the last thing he ever expected. "I need help." Emily couldn't believe the words had left her mouth. She had spent years looking down on people like Daniel, treating them like they were beneath her. Now, she was standing at his door, begging. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Why would I help you?" Emily's pride screamed at her to walk away, to pretend she didn't need anyone. But she did. She swallowed hard. I have nowhere else to go. Daniel didn't move. A tense silence hung between them. Then, a small voice spoke from inside. Daddy? Emily blinked as a little girl peeked around Daniel's leg, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. Emily had seen photos of her during the trial, Lily Cole. The reason Daniel had fought so hard. Lily studied Emily for a moment, then smiled. Hi, she said cheerfully. Are you hungry? Emily's throat tightened. Was she hungry? Her stomach had been screaming at her for hours, but no one had asked her that. No one had cared. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. Lily giggled. It's okay. Daddy makes really good peanut butter sandwiches. Daniel let out a quiet sigh, then stepped back. Come inside, he said gruffly. Emily hesitated, then slowly stepped over the threshold. As she did, one thought echoed in her mind. How did it come to this? Emily stepped cautiously into Daniel's small apartment, her designer heels clicking against the scuffed wooden floor. She took in her surroundings, the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. It was nothing like the world she knew. Her hands fidgeted at her sides as she turned to face Daniel. He shut the door, locking it behind him. She suddenly felt trapped. What do you want, Emily? Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm. Emily opened her mouth but hesitated. She had rehearsed this moment in her head before knocking on his door. She planned to demand, to convince him to let her stay just until she figured something out. But now, standing here, stripped of her wealth and status, with a hungry stomach and aching feet, all she could whisper was, I don't know. Daniel's gaze didn't soften. He crossed his arms, waiting. Emily clenched her fists. She hated this feeling, this weakness. I just need a place to stay for the night, she said quickly, forcing herself to regain some control. Just until What? Until you buy your way out? Daniel cut in. Until your rich friends bail you out? Emily flinched. Lily, who had been watching from the kitchen, hopped down from her chair and ran up to her father, tugging on his sleeve. Daddy, she whispered, loud enough for Emily to hear. We have to help. Daniel sighed. Emily hated that the decision wasn't in her hands. She was always the one in charge. Now, she was at his mercy. Fine, Daniel muttered, rubbing his forehead. You can stay for one night. Relief washed over Emily so fast it almost made her dizzy. She hated needing help, but at this moment, she couldn't afford to refuse it. But then Daniel's next words made her stiffen. But if you're staying here, he said firmly, you follow my rules. Emily narrowed her eyes. Rules? Daniel gestured around the apartment. This isn't a five-star hotel, Emily. You don't get a personal chef. You don't get servants. You pull your weight. Emily almost scoffed. Emily Hart, pulling her weight? But she had no options. Lily clapped her hands. Yay. You can help me set the table. Emily blinked. What? Lily didn't give her time to protest. She grabbed Emily's hand and dragged her toward the kitchen. And for the first time in her entire life, Emily Hart picked up a plate and set it on a table by herself. The peanut butter sandwich on Emily's plate stared back at her. She had never eaten anything so basic. No truffle shavings, no imported cheeses, no chef-crafted plating. Just peanut butter between two slices of white bread. Lily took a huge bite and grinned. Daddy makes the best sandwiches in the world. Emily hesitated, then picked up the sandwich. She took a bite. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't anything special. But at that moment, with hunger gnawing at her stomach, it was the best thing she had ever eaten. Daniel watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Why are you really here, Emily? He finally asked. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She didn't have an answer, because for the first time in her life, she didn't know who she was without her money. Hours later, as Emily sat on the small, lumpy couch with an old blanket wrapped around her, she stared at the ceiling. She had never slept in a place like this before, where the air wasn't purified, where the noise of the city wasn't blocked by triple-insulated windows. She had never felt so out of place. And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about Lily's smile, about the way Daniel watched over his daughter, protecting her with everything he had. She had mocked this man in the courtroom. Now, He had given her a roof over her head, something no one else had done. Emily turned on her side, hugging the blanket closer. Tomorrow, she'd figure something out. She had to, because she wouldn't survive like this for 90 days. She just wouldn't. Emily woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of a small giggle. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She expected to open her eyes and see the elegant ceilings of her penthouse, with the city skyline gleaming outside her massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Instead, she saw a cracked ceiling and a tiny, messy apartment. And then, reality hit her like a truck. She had nothing. No money. No home. No power. She was at Daniel Cole's mercy. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She sat up, her body aching from sleeping on the lumpy couch, and saw Lily sitting at the kitchen table, swinging her legs as Daniel poured her a cup of orange juice. The room was small, but warm. Lived in. Daniel turned and saw Emily. "You're up," he said simply. Emily stretched her sore limbs, trying not to look as miserable as she felt. "Yeah." Daniel slid a cup of coffee across the counter toward her. "Drink. It's not the fancy kind, but it's what we have." Emily hesitated. It was black coffee. No foam. No cinnamon sprinkles. No barista-crafted artwork on top. But she needed it. She took a small sip. It was bitter. Her usual coffee cost $20 and had caramel drizzle. This was basic, but she drank it anyway. Daniel sat across from her, his eyes studying her like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Emily hated it. "Have you figured out what you're going to do?" he asked. Emily stiffened. She had no idea. She had never had to plan anything for herself before. She had assistants, managers, PR teams, people who handled everything. Now, she had nothing. Daniel sighed, already reading the answer on her face. "You can't stay here for long, Emily," he said firmly. She bristled. "I know that. I have a daughter to take care of," Daniel continued. "I can't afford to take care of you, too." Emily's pride flared. "I don't need you to take care of me." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because last night you had nowhere to go." Emily's hands curled into fists. She hated this. She had spent years looking down on people like Daniel, thinking they were beneath her. Now, she was begging for his help. It was humiliating. "I'll find a job," she blurted out. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "A job? Doing what?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she do? She had never worked a day in her life. Her father had built an empire, and she had inherited the luxury of never having to lift a finger. Now, she had nothing to offer. Lily, still sitting at the table, perked up. "You can come to my school and be the lunch lady," she said excitedly. Emily blinked. "What?" Lily grinned. "Miss Patty, our lunch lady, makes the best mac and cheese. You can help her." Emily's face burned. A lunch lady? Her? Before she could protest, Daniel spoke. "She's got a point," he said, smirking slightly. "You need money. And right now, that's a job you could actually get." Emily scoffed. "You think I'm going to serve food to children?" Daniel shrugged. "I think you don't have many options." Emily clenched her jaw. She would rather die than work in a cafeteria. Wouldn't she? Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since the peanut butter sandwich last night. And without money, there wouldn't be another meal waiting for her. Daniel leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Welcome to the real world, Emily," he said quietly. Emily swallowed hard. For the first time in her life, she wasn't untouchable. For the first time in her life, she had to survive. And that meant doing something she never imagined. Working. Emily stood outside the elementary school cafeteria, arms crossed, staring at the chipped blue doors like they were prison gates. This was humiliating. She had spent her life dining in five-star restaurants, attended by world-class chefs. Now, she was about to serve children. Her stomach twisted. How had it come to this? She gritted her teeth and stepped inside. The cafeteria was a noisy, chaotic mess. Kids laughing, shouting, spilling their juice boxes. The smell of warm food filled the air, but it wasn't anything gourmet. Just simple, greasy school meals. Behind the counter, a plump woman with curly gray hair stood, stirring a giant pot. She turned and spotted Emily. Well, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. You must be the new hire. Emily hesitated. She wanted to correct the woman, to tell her she wasn't just some low-level cafeteria worker. She was Emily Hart. But she wasn't anymore. So, instead, she just nodded stiffly. The woman smiled. I'm Patty. Welcome to the team, sweetheart. Emily did not want to be on this team, but she had no choice. Patty handed her a hairnet. Emily stared at it like it was poison. Put it on. Honey, Patty said, smirking. Health codes. Emily's hands shook as she pulled the hideous thing over her hair. If her old friends could see her now, she wanted to disappear. Lunch hour began, and the line of students stretched across the room. Emily stood behind the counter, gripping a giant metal spoon, staring at the mystery slop she was supposed to serve. Patty nudged her. Go on, honey. Just scoop and plop. Emily scowled. Scoop and plop? Was that really her life now? She swallowed her pride and did it. Scoop. Plop. A little boy with freckles stared at his tray and made a face. Ew, he muttered. Emily's eye twitched. He didn't realize he was talking to Emily Hart, the woman who used to wear $1,000 dresses and sip champagne in Paris. But now, she was just the lunch lady. The next kid moved forward, and she kept serving, her hands getting greasy, her arms aching. By the time the last kid had gone through, her back hurt, her feet were sore, and she hated everything. Patty patted her shoulder. You did good, sweetheart. Emily didn't feel good. She felt miserable. She wanted to quit. She wanted to scream. But she couldn't, because quitting meant starving. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. Later that night, Emily sat at Daniel's tiny kitchen table, exhausted. Lily sat across from her, happily eating mac and cheese. You did it, Lily chirped. You were a lunch lady. Emily groaned, dropping her head on the table. Daniel chuckled. Rough first day? Emily glared at him. Those kids are monsters. Daniel smirked. Welcome to the working class. Emily clenched her fists. She hated that he was enjoying this. But more than that, she hated that for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to survive it. Emily dragged herself into the tiny apartment, her entire body aching. She had spent years walking on marble floors and designer heels, yet somehow, standing behind a cafeteria counter for a few hours had completely destroyed her. She dropped onto the lumpy couch, groaning. Lily giggled from across the room, spooning another bite of mac and cheese into her mouth. You look really tired. Emily shot her a glare. I am really tired. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching her struggle. First day of actual work. How does it feel? Emily exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Like I got hit by a truck. Daniel smirked. Welcome to the real world. Emily sat up, her eyes narrowing. Is that what this is? Some lesson? Daniel didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. It was a lesson, and for the first time, Emily was failing. The next morning, Emily woke up before sunrise, her muscles screaming in protest. She had never set an alarm before. Her assistants had always woken her up, bringing her imported coffee and carefully curated breakfast trays. Now, the only thing waking her up was reality. She stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing her tired eyes, and found Daniel already up, making eggs. She frowned. You cook? Daniel glanced at her. Do you think food just magically appears? Emily rolled her eyes but said nothing. Lily bounced into the kitchen, already dressed for school. Daddy makes the best eggs. Emily crossed her arms. That's a bold claim. Daniel smirked. Would you like to test it? Emily hesitated. The old her would have refused out of pure pride. But her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she didn't have the luxury of being picky anymore. She sat down. Daniel slid a plate in front of her, 2 simple scrambled eggs on toast. No garnish. No imported ingredients. Emily took a hesitant bite. It was good. Daniel arched an eyebrow. Well? Emily hated that she liked it. She scowled. It's edible. Daniel chuckled. I'll take that as a win. Lily giggled, swinging her legs as she ate. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Like she wasn't a fallen billionaire. Like she wasn't living in a stranger's home. like she wasn't completely alone. But the moment passed quickly, because as soon as breakfast was over, reality came crashing back in. She had work to do. Back at the cafeteria, Emily tried to avoid the glaring truth. She was getting worse at this job, not better. She spilled food. She burned her hand on a tray. She had a near breakdown when a 5-year-old sneezed directly into her apron. By the time the lunch rush ended, she was 1 second away from quitting. Patty, the head lunch lady, patted her back. "You're getting the hang of it." Emily stared at her. "I just dropped a tray of mashed potatoes." Patty shrugged. "You didn't drop it on a kid." "Improvement." Emily groaned, rubbing her face. "I don't belong here." Patty leaned against the counter. "You know, I looked you up," she said casually. Emily froze. Patty smirked. Emily Hart, billionaire heiress. The one who mocked the man she put in the hospital. Emily's stomach twisted. She hated hearing it like that. Patty studied her. "Funny thing is, I don't see a billionaire standing in front of me. I just see a tired, lost girl trying to survive." Emily didn't know how to respond to that. Patty smiled. "Keep working, honey. You might actually find out who you are." And with that, she walked away. Emily stood there, gripping the counter, her chest tightening. Because the terrifying thing was, she wasn't sure she even knew who she was anymore. Emily sat on the lumpy couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her muscles ached. Her hair smelled like cafeteria food. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely useless. She had no skills. She had no plan. She had nothing. The thought gnawed at her, making her stomach twist. A few weeks ago, she had been untouchable, flying in private jets, attending elite galas, spending thousands of dollars on things she didn't even need. Now, she was a lunch lady. She had spent years thinking she was better than people like Daniel, looking at them as if they had made bad life choices. But now, she was in his world, and she was failing. The next morning, Emily forced herself out of bed, dreading another day of humiliation. She wasn't made for this kind of life. She wasn't strong enough for this. She stumbled into the kitchen, where Daniel was already making breakfast. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Rough night?" Emily scoffed. "Every night is a rough night." Daniel smirked, sliding a plate of eggs across the counter. "Eat. You'll need the energy." Emily eyed the food but didn't touch it. "Why do you even care?" she muttered. Daniel leaned against the counter. "I don't." Emily rolled her eyes. "Then why let me stay here?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Because despite everything, I know what it's like to be left with nothing." Emily's stomach clenched. She had never thought about it that way. To her, Daniel had always been a nobody, just a man who got in her way. But now, sitting in his home, eating his food, and living in his reality, she realized that Daniel was stronger than she had ever been, and that terrified her. At work, Patty handed Emily a mop. Emily stared at it like it was a foreign object. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked. Patty smirked. "Mop." Emily groaned. "This is getting ridiculous." Patty crossed her arms. "You think you're too good for this?" Emily hesitated. The old her would have said yes. But the new her? She didn't know anymore. With a deep breath, she grabbed the mop and started cleaning. It was humiliating. It was boring. It was beneath her. But for the first time in her life, she was earning something, and that scared her more than anything. Emily's hands ached as she wrung out the dirty mop water. Her designer nails, once pristine and polished, were chipped and worn. The calluses forming on her palms were a cruel reminder that her life had changed in ways she never imagined. She had spent the day serving lunch to kids who didn't appreciate it, scrubbing tables sticky with juice, and mopping floors, something she had once thought only existed for other people. Now, she was one of those people. Patty patted her shoulder. "Not bad, kid." Emily scowled. "I mopped a cafeteria floor. I think my ancestors are rolling in their graves." Patty laughed. "Good. Let him roll." Emily sighed. "This is so humiliating." Patty's face softened. "You know what's actually humiliating?" Emily braced herself. Patty leaned in, needing help and being too proud to ask for it. Emily flinched. She had spent her whole life acting like she didn't need anyone, like she was above people who struggled. But now, Now she was struggling too, and it was horrible. Patty pointed a finger at her. You don't like being here. I get it. But life isn't about where you start. It's about where you go from here. Emily swallowed hard, because deep down, she wasn't sure where she was going anymore. That night, back at Daniel's apartment, she sat at the tiny kitchen table, pushing a spoon around her plate. Lily was telling a story about school, something about a spelling bee, but Emily barely heard it. Her mind was too loud. Daniel, sitting across from her, noticed. You okay? Emily blinked. No one had ever asked her that before. Not really. She stared at him. I don't know. Daniel put his fork down, studying her. What's going on? Emily let out a breath. I don't think I can do this. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Do what? Emily gestured around. This. The working. The struggling. The not knowing what's next. Daniel nodded slowly. That's life. Emily scoffed. Well, it sucks. Daniel smirked. You're not wrong. She looked away, frustration bubbling up in her chest. I don't belong here. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. Then where do you belong, Emily? Emily froze, because for the first time in her life, she didn't know the answer. She wasn't the billionaire anymore. She wasn't the queen of the fashion world. She wasn't the spoiled heiress who could buy her way out of trouble. She was just Emily, and she had no idea who that was. Later that night, as she lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, she heard Daniel moving around in the kitchen. She turned her head, watching as he put away Lily's school books, tidied up the dishes, and rubbed his face tiredly. He was exhausted, and yet he kept going, because he had to. Emily had never been that kind of person. She had never had to fight for anything. But now, maybe it was time to start, because if she didn't, she might never find herself again. Emily woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The air was cold, the small apartment dim in the early morning light. For a few blissful seconds, she forgot where she was. Then, reality came crashing back. She wasn't in her penthouse. She wasn't waking up to fresh pastries and a morning massage. She was on Daniel Cole's couch, surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and cafeteria wages. The weight of it pressed against her chest. But today, something felt different. Today, she wasn't just dreading the day. She was determined. She didn't know why. Maybe it was because Daniel had called her out last night. Maybe it was because for the first time in her life, someone had asked her where she belonged, and she hadn't known the answer. And that scared her more than anything. She had spent her life believing she was above the world, untouchable, special. Now, she was just another person trying to get by. And she had a choice to make. Keep sulking, or start fighting. She threw off the blanket and got up. It was time to do something. At work, Emily didn't just stand behind the counter, waiting for the day to end. She paid attention. She noticed the way Patty worked effortlessly, flipping burgers, scooping food, managing the chaos like it was second nature. She noticed the way the other workers moved with purpose, never wasting a second. For the first time, she watched. And for the first time, she realized there was a system. There was an efficiency to this life she had looked down on, and she had been too arrogant to see it. So today, instead of complaining, she tried. She tried to move faster. She tried to get the portions right. She tried to keep up, and she failed. Miserably. She dropped a tray. She spilled sauce on herself. She burned her fingers on a hot pan. And yet, Patty only laughed. Better than yesterday, she said with a grin. Which means you're learning. Emily stared at her. You think I'm getting better? Patty winked. No, honey. I think you want to get better. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, she realized Patty was right. That evening, when Emily walked into Daniel's apartment, she didn't collapse onto the couch like usual. Instead, she went to the kitchen. Daniel glanced up from where he was helping Lily with her homework. You okay? Emily nodded, opening the fridge. She pulled out the eggs and bread. Daniel's eyebrows shot up. What are you doing? Emily turned on the stove. Making dinner. Daniel stared at her. Lily's eyes went wide. You know how to cook? Emily cracked an egg and immediately broke the yolk. She scowled. Daniel chuckled. I'll take that as a no. Emily shot him a glare, but she didn't stop. She kept going. The eggs were messy. The toast was slightly burned. The whole thing looked sad. But when she placed the plate in front of Lily, the little girl beamed. Lily took a big bite and grinned. This is so good. Emily knew she was lying, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely useless. And that was something. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her. You know, Emily, he said quietly, you might actually survive this. Emily met his gaze. For the first time, she believed him. Emily stood outside the grocery store, staring at the $5 bill in her hand. It was nothing to the person she used to be. A single bill, crumpled and worn. But today, it was everything. It was her money, earned from her job, not from her father's name or an assistant's bank card. And she had to make it stretch. She walked inside, scanning the aisles. She couldn't just grab the most expensive item like before. Now, she had to think. A loaf of bread, some eggs, the cheapest peanut butter on the shelf. When she handed the cashier her money, she felt something strange. Pride. She had never cared about money before, never even thought about it. But today, she had earned this food. It was a small victory, but it was hers. Back at the apartment, Daniel watched as she unpacked the groceries. He smirked. Look at you. Surviving. Emily rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Because he wasn't wrong. She was still here. She was still standing. Lily ran into the kitchen, her eyes lighting up. Did you buy peanut butter? Emily held up the jar. Lily cheered. Best day ever. Emily chuckled. You have very low standards. Daniel chuckled too, but there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. Respect? Understanding? Maybe both. Later that night, as Emily lay on the couch, she thought about the old her. The Emily who had mocked Daniel in court. The Emily who had never worked a day in her life. The Emily who had thought she was better than everyone. She hated that person, because now, she knew the truth. Life wasn't about money. It was about strength. About getting back up when everything fell apart. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just Emily Hart, the billionaire's daughter. She was Emily Hart, the woman who survived. And that meant more than any fortune ever could. 3 months later, Emily sat outside the courthouse, waiting for her final hearing. The judge had given her 90 days to live without wealth. And she had done it. She had worked. She had struggled. She had survived. And now, she didn't know if she even wanted her old life back. She glanced at Daniel, who sat beside her, arms crossed. So, he said, what now? Emily took a deep breath. That was the million-dollar question. Because she had a choice. Go back to her old world, or keep moving forward. She looked at Daniel, and for the first time, she smiled. I guess we'll find out.